There are days in your life that arrive without warning. Days that begin with sunlight touching your face the same way it has every morning. Days that promise nothing extraordinary, nothing unusual, nothing life-altering. And then, without asking your permission, these days unfold into chapters you never expected to live. That birthday of mine was one of those days. It started gently, quietly, with that familiar warmth of routine wrapped around me like a soft blanket. I woke up to the faint scent of breakfast in the kitchen, the distant hum of the ceiling fan, and the subtle excitement of turning another year older. Birthdays have always felt like a chance to breathe, to pause, to reconnect with myself. Even if the world wasn't planning a celebration, even if no one was singing or surprising me, I always held a little gratitude in my heart for making it through another year. That morning, I didn't know life had prepared a different kind of gift for me. A truth wrapped in 30 years of silence. I didn't know my husband had woken before me, pacing the hallway with a confession sitting heavily on his tongue, unsure of how to say it, unsure of what would happen after he did. But at that moment, all I noticed was that the air felt different, not cold, not warm, just different, like the world was holding its breath. I walked into the living room expecting the usual birthday smile from him, maybe a slightly awkward hug, maybe a small gift placed on the table the way he had done in previous years. But instead, there he was, sitting on the edge of the sofa, elbows on his knees, fingers interlocked, eyes staring at the floor. It looked like he was waiting for something, or someone, or maybe just the courage he'd been avoiding for decades. When he finally looked up at me, I saw something I hadn't seen in a long time. Not anger, not irritation, not distance. I saw fear. The kind of fear that makes the strongest person crumble. The kind of fear that tells you their world is about to split open. I smiled anyway, not because everything was fine, not because I understood. I smiled because that's how life teaches you to show up even when you're not ready. You show up with grace. You show up with stillness. You show up even when the ground beneath you feels uncertain. I walked toward him, thinking maybe he was worried about forgetting my birthday, or maybe he had made some mistake at work, or maybe he wanted to talk about something simple and everyday. I wasn't prepared. My heart wasn't braced. My mind wasn't guarded for the words he had been carrying for 30 years. He asked me to sit down. His voice was low, softer than usual, almost cracking around the edges. I took a seat, waiting, still smiling, unaware that the moment I sat down, my life had quietly shifted its direction. He looked at his hands, then at me, then back at his hands again, as if debating whether he should let the truth out or bury it for another 30 years. But something inside him had decided that this was the day. My birthday, a day most people receive gifts, but I was about to receive something else entirely. When he finally started speaking, his words didn't come out in full sentences. They came in fragments, broken pieces of a story he had rehearsed 1,000 times in his head but never voiced aloud. His confession began with an apology. The kind of apology that doesn't solve anything but hints at the storm waiting behind it. His breathing grew heavier, faster, as if every word was a weight he had to drag forward. And even though I didn't yet know what he was going to say, a part of me felt the shift. In the room, the heaviness settling into the walls, the air tightening around us, I remember feeling my heartbeat slow down, as if preparing itself, steadying itself, sensing something was coming. There are moments when your body knows before your mind does. Something deep inside you whispers, brace yourself. And even though you don't know why, you feel your soul pull up its guard. He told me he needed to be honest with me, truly honest. And the way he said it, the weight behind his tone made every nerve in my body pay attention. He said he had been keeping something from me, something he should have told me long ago, something he never found the courage to say, something that had shaped our life in ways I hadn't even realized. I didn't interrupt him. I didn't ask questions. I didn't demand answers. I sat there, quietly breathing slowly, letting him find his words. And sometimes silence is the greatest strength you can hold. It gives the truth space to emerge. It gives the heart space to prepare. He started talking about the early years of our marriage, about choice he made when he was younger, choices he thought he could outrun. He talked about moments where he should have told me the truth, but didn't because he was afraid of losing me, afraid of changing the life we had built together, afraid of facing the consequences of who he really was back then. He said he never planned for the truth to stay hidden this long. He thought he would tell me one day. He thought the right moment would come. But life doesn't hand you perfect moments for confession. It hands you guilt. It hands you reminders. It hands you nights where you can't sleep because the truth presses against your chest like a fist. And for him, that fist had grown heavier each year. As he spoke, I watched him not with anger, not with disbelief, but with an odd mixture of sadness and clarity. I realized I had lived beside a man who carried two lives, the one he shared with me and the one he kept tucked away in the dark, hoping the shadows would never spill into our sunlight. And on my birthday, the shadows finally stepped forward. He finally lifted his eyes to meet mine, and in them I saw 30 years of something that looked a lot like regret. He said he didn't want to lie to me anymore. He said he couldn't. Not on this day. Not knowing that time was passing, that life was moving, that the weight he carried had become unbearable. And then, the confession came out slowly at first, then all at once, like floodgates cracking open after years of pressure. I remember the exact moment the truth left his lips. The sound of it felt like something shattering inside the room, like glass breaking somewhere in the distance. And even though his words pierced something deep inside me, I didn't react. I didn't gasp, didn't cry, didn't back away. I simply sat there, listening, allowing each piece of truth to land exactly where it needed to. Because sometimes strength isn't loud. Sometimes strength is the quiet decision to hear the whole truth before choosing what to do with it. He told me everything, every detail he had shielded with excuses. Every moment he had justified to himself. Every part of the truth he had convinced himself didn't matter anymore. And the strange thing about truth is that it doesn't rot or fade with time. It waits patiently, silently, until the moment it is forced into the open. And when it comes, it doesn't arrive gently. It arrives like a reckoning. As he spoke, I watched his hands shake. I watched the way his shoulders trembled. I watched the guilt rise through him like a tide, swallowing him whole. A part of me felt sorry for him, not for what he had done, but for how long he had carried it alone. Another part of me felt something harder, something sharper, something that recognized the betrayal not in the truth itself, but in the years of silence that followed it. When he finished speaking, the room went quiet. Not the comfortable kind of quiet, but the kind that echoes in your bones. A quiet that asks you to decide who you are going to be next. A quiet that demands honesty not from him, but from yourself. I took a deep breath. Not because I was ready, but because breathing was the only thing I could do in that moment. I felt the weight of everything he had said settle onto my shoulders, but underneath that weight, something else began to rise. A strength I didn't realize I had. A clarity I didn't expect. A certainty that the moment I had always feared, the moment someone's truth might break me, was actually the moment that would rebuild me. And then, as he sat there waiting for me to speak, waiting for me to scream or cry or fall apart, I did the thing he least expected. I smiled, not because I forgave him, not because I accepted his truth, but because I had known something long before he ever confessed it. Deep inside, I had felt the shift in our life years ago, the quiet distance, the subtle changes in his behavior, the moments where something felt incomplete, but I couldn't explain why. I had known something was wrong. I just didn't know what. But what he didn't know, what he had never imagined, was that I had prepared for this day long before he spoke a single word. Life teaches you to listen to your instincts. Life teaches you to sense storms before they arrive. Life teaches you to be ready, always, for people to show you who they really are. And so I had prepared something, not out of anger, not out of revenge, but out of self-respect. Out of the need to reclaim my own story. I looked at him, still silent, still composed, still breathing steadily. And when he asked me why I was smiling, I told him something he never expected to hear. I told him that while he had spent 30 years preparing his confession, I had spent 30 years preparing my answer. And that answer was inside the box I had kept hidden all along. I didn't hand it to him yet. Not in that moment. Not while the confession was still hanging in the air. Not while he was still catching his breath. I waited. I let the silence settle. I let the truth absorb into the space between us. I let him understand that honesty doesn't erase consequences. Confession doesn't negate responsibility. And truth, once spoken, demands action from both sides. My birthday had become a crossroads not just for him, but for me. A turning point. A moment that asked me to decide whether I would shrink under the weight of his truth or rise above it with the strength I had been cultivating in the quiet corners of my heart. And so, as he waited for my reaction, unaware of what I had planned, unaware of what that box symbolized, unaware of how ready I truly was, I simply placed my hand over my heart and reminded myself of one important truth. This was not the end of my story. It was the beginning. There is a moment right after someone finishes saying the words they've been terrified to speak, where time doesn't feel real anymore. It stretches, it bends, it presses itself tightly around you. almost as if the air itself is trying to understand what has just happened. When my husband finally let the truth slip out of him that day, that is exactly what the room felt like: distorted, suspended, waiting for someone, anyone, to breathe first. And even though I sat there quietly, even though I didn't move or speak or ask him for more, inside my chest, something stirred deeply. It wasn't anger, not yet. It wasn't even heartbreak. That would come later. What I felt first was an immense wave of recognition, not of the details he had confessed, but of the man sitting across from me. The way he exhaled after saying the truth, the way his shoulders slumped as if 30 invisible bricks had finally rolled off his back, the way his hands trembled afterward. I realized then that the confession he had given me wasn't one moment of honesty. It was the release of decades of fear, the kind of fear that eats away the edges of a person's soul, the kind that forces them to build walls so high around themselves that they forget what living honestly even feels like. And somehow, even before my emotions could settle, I understood something important. What he had carried all those years had shaped him more than it had shaped me. I had been unknowingly living beside a secret, but he had been living inside it, breathing it, waking up with it, going to bed with it, praying it would disappear. But secrets don't fade. They attach themselves to the shadows of a person's choices and follow them no matter how far they try to run. So as he sat there staring at me with eyes that looked older than the last time I had really looked at him, I saw a man who had been haunted, but understanding that didn't erase the truth he had spoken. It didn't soften the sharp edges of it. It didn't erase the years that had been shaped by a lie. It only made the moment more real, more human, more painful. He tried to explain himself, stumbling from one sentence to another, piecing together excuses he must have rehearsed 1,000 nights when sleep refused to come. He talked about fear, about immaturity, about doing what he thought was right at the time. But the thing about confessions is that they never truly land in the explanations, they land in the consequences. And even as his words attempted to soften the blow, the truth stood tall between us like a wall neither of us could ignore anymore. I watched him as he spoke, and in that moment, I realized I wasn't looking at the man I had spent my life with. I was looking at a version of him I had never met, a version stripped of defenses, stripped of authority, stripped of the certainty he used to carry in his stride. I saw a man who was breaking down, not because his truth was finally out, but because he didn't know how I would hold it. Confessions demand two things: courage from the one who speaks them and strength from the one who receives them. And in that moment, he had finally offered his courage. Now the strength part rested with me. But strength doesn't rush. It doesn't leap to conclusions or lash out before it's ready. Strength sits quietly. Strength listens. Strength breathes. Strength waits until the heart catches up with the truth. He kept talking, attempting to give me the full picture. The more he spoke, the more the room filled with details I wasn't sure I wanted to hear. But I didn't stop him. If he was going to confess, I wanted the entire truth, not the edited version, not the selective pieces, not the parts that made him look better. I wanted the raw, unfiltered truth he had held back from me for so long. Because if there's one thing I've learned in this life, it's that half-truths can wound you more deeply than lies. At least lies are predictable, they eventually unravel. But half-truths? They disguise themselves as honesty while still leaving you in the dark. He paused at one point, his voice cracking mid-sentence, and I could see the exhaustion in him. Confessing was taking something out of him, something he didn't know how to reclaim. But I didn't move to comfort him, not because I didn't care, but because I couldn't carry the weight of his guilt and my own heartbreak at the same time. Confession demands responsibility. He had to sit in his own truth before I could decide what to do with mine, so I let the silence sit. Silence has a way of exposing things that words try to cover up. It amplifies the sound of guilt. It magnifies the weight of regret. It forces a person to stand face to face with the reality they've created. And in that silence, I saw him shift uncomfortably, as if suddenly realizing that the truth didn't free him from the responsibility of living with its consequences. I inhaled slowly, letting the air fill my lungs, grounding myself in the moment. The truth he had confessed hurt. There is no poetic way to soften that. I felt something inside me loosen, something break off quietly, almost gently. Not dramatic, not explosive, just a soft tearing at the edges of trust. A quiet realization that the life I thought we had shared was not the life he had lived. But here's the strange thing. I didn't crumble. I didn't feel myself falling apart or drowning under the weight of his confession. Instead, I felt myself rising above it, not because I was stronger than the pain, but because I had seen this moment coming long before he even realized he would have to speak the truth. My intuition had been whispering to me for years, gently tugging at my awareness, reminding me that something wasn't aligned. And while I didn't know the specifics, My heart had been preparing itself for a moment like this. Prepared hearts don't break the same way unprepared hearts do. He finally asked me what I was thinking, his voice barely loud enough for the room to hear. There was something desperate in his tone, a plea, a hope, maybe even a prayer. He wanted reassurance. He wanted forgiveness. He wanted me to say something that would soften the guilt he had finally allowed to rise to the surface. But I couldn't offer him that. Not then. Not yet. Because truth isn't something you absorb instantly. It settles slowly. It needs time to move through you. Time to reshape your understanding of the world you thought you were living in. I told him I needed a moment. And he nodded a little too eagerly, as if afraid that silence meant losing me. But in that moment, I wasn't thinking about leaving. I was thinking about who I was becoming in the presence of his truth. I stood up and walked toward the window, letting the light fall onto my face. Sometimes you need to step into the light, just to remind yourself that you haven't disappeared inside someone else's darkness. I watched the world outside the trees standing tall, the sky stretching far, children laughing in the distance. Life continued, untouched by the storm inside my living room. And something about that steadiness grounded me, reminded me that the world doesn't end just because your heart is hurting. The world waits for you to decide your next step. I turned back to him slowly, and in that moment, I saw his eyes searching mine, not for anger, but for hope. He wanted to know if he had destroyed everything with his truth. He wanted to know if there was a path forward. He wanted to know if the life we had built could survive the confession he had just poured into my hands. And here's the thing I realized right then. Truth doesn't destroy relationships, secrets do. His truth hurt me. But his silence had hurt me longer. And even though he had finally spoken, I knew this wasn't the moment to decide the fate of our life together. Not yet. Not while emotions were raw and the confession was still selling. So I walked closer to him, slowly, deliberately, letting each step remind me that I was still in control of my own story. And when I reached him, I said something he didn't expect. I told him that while I couldn't undo what I'd heard, I needed him to understand something very clearly. A confession isn't the end of accountability, it is the beginning of it. He has asked me why I wasn't reacting the way he expected, why I wasn't yelling or crying or walking away. And I told him the truth. I told him that broken trust doesn't always scream it. Sometimes goes quiet, so it can rebuild itself the right way. I told him that I wasn't going to give him an instant decision about us. I wasn't going to make a choice based solely on emotion. I wasn't going to let his truth drag me into chaos, because life has taught me that when someone finally shows you their truth, you don't respond with impulse, you respond with clarity. His confession wasn't just a moment of honesty. It was a test of who I was, of who I refused to become, of who I was ready to grow into. And when I looked at him again, I realized that something inside me had already changed, not in a way that broke me, but in a way that awakened me. His truth had forced me to meet a version of myself that had been quietly sleeping behind years of routine, a version that stood steadier, spoke calmer, saw clearer. And this new version of me understood something essential. The box I had prepared, the one he still didn't know about, would become the answer not to his confession, but to my own awakening. Because while he had spent decades fearing the moment his truth would be exposed, I had spent my life preparing for the moment I would finally choose my own voice. And that moment was closer than he realized. There is a unique kind of pain that sits quietly inside a person, a pain that doesn't scream or lash out, but instead folds itself neatly into the smallest corners of the heart. It doesn't show itself to the world. It doesn't announce its arrival. It doesn't give you the courtesy of a warning. It simply settles inside you, deep and silent, and waits for the moment when you finally gather the courage to face it. That was the pain I felt after hearing his confession, quiet, heavy, strangely calm, but undeniably there. Even as I sat across from him, even as his words still echoed in the back of my mind, even as my heart processed the truth it never asked to receive, something inside me refused to unravel. I felt the pull of heartbreak, but I held myself together, not because I wanted to pretend everything was fine, but because there is a strength in stillness that I had spent years unknowingly practicing. A strength that reminded me I didn't need to collapse just because the truth had finally come to light. But holding myself together didn't mean I was unaffected. Far from it. The truth had cut into me in a way I hadn't anticipated, not with the sharpness of shock, but with the slow ache of clarity. It was the kind of pain that doesn't explode, it sinks, it wraps itself around your thoughts. It changes the shape of your memories. It asks you silent questions you never prepared to answer. And while he spoke, while he waited, while he looked at me with fear and regret twisting through every line on his face, I felt that pain weaving itself around my breath like a quiet reminder that everything I thought I understood about my life now carried a crack through it. I kept my face calm, even peaceful, Because sometimes peace is the only shield you have when the world shifts under your feet. My heart trembled, yes. My throat tightened, yes. But I didn't let the storm inside me rise to the surface. I didn't want to give the moment more chaos than it already carried. I just let him finish. I just let myself breathe. I just let the truth settle. He didn't know what it took for me to sit there without breaking. He didn't know the strength it takes for a woman to protect her dignity in the middle of heartbreak. He didn't know how many times I had taught myself to hold my emotions until I was ready to feel them. People think strength is loud. They think it's aggressive, explosive, forceful. But real strength, true, lived, human strength is quiet. It's the decision to hold your head steady when your heart is splitting. It's the decision to breathe when everything in you wants to collapse. It's the decision to listen fully, even when listening hurts. And so I stayed there, present, silent, steady. Inside, memories were rearranging themselves. Not dramatic memories, not big moments, just small ones. The times he seemed distant, but blamed it on stress. The way he sometimes avoided certain topics. The heaviness in his eyes on nights when laughter filled the house, but he couldn't join in. All those little signs that make sense only in hindsight. All those tiny moments that have tucked themselves into the folds of our life, quietly waiting for their explanation. I felt the truth settle like dust over everything I thought I knew. Not ruining it, but revealing it. And yet, even through the ache, even through the realization that my life had been woven with threads I never saw, I felt a strange calm inside me. A calm that didn't come from acceptance, but from resilience. A calm that whispered, "You will get through this, you already are." I could feel him watching me, trying to read every shift in my expression, searching for a signal, any signal of what this moment would become. His confession had left him exposed, vulnerable, terrified. But my reaction, my silence, my stillness, my refusal to break in front of him, that scared him more than anything. Because silence is powerful. Silence is mysterious. Silence forces someone to see themselves without distraction. And in that silence, I felt an odd sense of control. Not control over him, control over myself, over my emotions, over my dignity, over the story I was writing in real time with every breath I took. The truth he confessed hurt deeply, but it didn't hollow me out. It awakened something. A self-awareness I didn't know I had. A voice inside me that stood up a little taller, reminding me that I wasn't powerless, that I wasn't defined by anyone else's choices, that heartbreak may touch me, but it could not reshape who I was unless I allowed it to. As the minutes passed, the weight of what he had admitted began settling into the space between us like thick fog. He tried reaching for my hand once, hesitantly, as if he wanted to guide me through the pain he had created, but I gently pulled my hand away, not out of cruelty, not out of anger, but out of necessity. Sometimes, to understand your own heart, you need space from the same hands that have wounded it. He looked down, ashamed, and for the first time that day, I felt something sharp inside my chest, not anger at what he had done, but sadness at the moment we had arrived in. Two people who had shared a life, sitting inches apart yet feeling oceans away from each other. I felt my strength being tested in ways I had never rehearsed. It wasn't about pretending to be fine. It wasn't about hiding my emotions. It was about holding on to myself when everything else felt uncertain. It was about breathing through the ache without letting it break me. It was about witnessing my own heartbreak without rushing to fix it, numb it, or escape from it. Pain has a way of bringing you face to face with the version of yourself that you've ignored for too long, the version that whispers truth you haven't been ready to hear. Sitting there, I met that version of myself. The one who had always sensed something was off but didn't know what. The one who learned to swallow disappointment quietly so peace could survive another day. The one who had given too much grace for too many years without demanding the same in return. And as my heart cracked, that version of me rose steady, clear-eyed, impossibly quiet, but undeniably present. I realized then that heartbreak doesn't always look like collapse. Sometimes it looks like composure. Sometimes it looks like a deep breath taken at exactly the right moment. Sometimes it looks like a quiet woman sitting upright, refusing to let someone else's truth push her into chaos. I understood something else too. Pain doesn't diminish you, it reveals you. It reveals what you care about. It reveals what you've ignored. It reveals who you've been and who you're becoming. It reveals your strength more clearly than joy ever could. He apologized again, and again, and again. Every apology carried a tremor of desperation, as if he was trying to erase the truth by repeating his regret. But apologies, no matter how sincere, do not untell the story. They do not rewind time. They do not erase the emotional footprint someone leaves on your heart. They simply acknowledge the damage, and I didn't need acknowledgement. I needed understanding, my own understanding of what this moment meant for me, not for him. So I let him speak, and I let myself feel, but I didn't let myself break. Not yet. Not there, not in front of him. There is a sacredness in the tears that fall only when you are alone. There is dignity in saving certain emotions for the quiet moments when the world is not watching. And I knew that when I finally allowed myself to cry, it would not be in that room, with him waiting for my reaction. It would be somewhere safe, somewhere quiet, somewhere where my tears belonged to me, not to the consequences of his actions. Eventually, I stood up. It wasn't planned. My body just moved, as if guiding me toward a moment of separation, a moment to remind myself that I existed outside of this confession. He looked up at me with panic in his eyes, afraid I had made a decision he wasn't ready to hear. But I wasn't walking away from him. I was walking toward myself. I needed to feel the ground under my feet without the weight of his guilt pressing into it. I needed to remember that my voice, my mind, my dignity still belonged to me. I needed to reclaim the space inside my own heart that had just been shaken. So I walked to the other side of the room and placed my hand on my chest, breathing deeply, reminding myself that I was still whole even if a piece of me was hurting. When I turned back to him, he looked smaller, somehow not physically, but emotionally, as if the truth had peeled away the layers he had worn for decades, and in that moment I realized something important. His confession may have broken something between us, but it had awakened something within me. It had awakened a woman who had learned to hold heartbreak with grace. A woman who knew how to suffer without shattering. A woman who understood that pain was not a punishment, it was a passage. A woman who would choose her response carefully, intentionally, powerfully. I walked slowly toward him again, not to comfort him, not to forgive him, not to reassure him, but to reclaim my space in the moment, to stand fully in the truth without letting it crush me, to let my eyes speak the words my heart wasn't ready to voice. And in that silence, with both of us standing in the shadow of a confession that had changed everything, I finally understood the depth of my own resilience. I wasn't weak for feeling hurt. I wasn't fragile for being shaken. I wasn't broken for needing time. I was human, and I was strong. But more importantly, I was ready. Ready to face the truth without letting it define me. Ready to feel the pain without letting it own me. Ready to move through the heartbreak without losing myself. Ready to take the next step, not for him, but for me. And that was the moment I knew exactly why I had prepared the box. It wasn't out of rage. It wasn't out of revenge. It wasn't out of fear. It was out of the deep, unshakable recognition that sometimes the quietest heartbreak births the strongest decision. And my decision was already waiting inside that box. I had always believed that life gives us quiet warnings before a storm. Little nudges. Moments that feel off. Whispers in the back of your mind telling you something isn't right. For years, I felt those whispers. Sometimes they were loud enough to stop me mid-step, sometimes soft enough to fade before I could name them. But they were always there, circling, waiting, reminding me that the truth often arrives long before the confession. And that was why, long before my husband ever stood in front of me on that birthday, spilled the words he'd been hiding, I had already done my own kind of preparation. Not because I wanted revenge, not because I wanted to shock him, but because deep inside I knew a day would come when I would need to hand him something that spoke louder than any argument, louder than any scream, louder than any explanation he thought he deserved. It wasn't a plan made out of anger. It wasn't even a plan born from suspicion. It was a plan born from clarity, the kind of clarity a person gets when they realize they cannot keep living with secrets that are not theirs, cannot keep covering wounds that they did not cause, cannot keep pretending that silence is peace. So weeks before my birthday, when he was still smiling, still pretending, still acting like the past had no shadow, I sat at the edge of my bed one night and thought to myself, he is going to break something in me, but I will decide what happens after. That was the night I chose the box. And not just any box, a plain one, simple, silent. Because if truth needs fireworks to be believed, it isn't truth. Truth stands quietly and is still undeniable. I remember placing it in the back of my closet, behind sweaters I rarely wore, behind shoes I never used. Not hidden because I was afraid he would find it, but hidden because I wanted to protect the meaning of what it held. I knew that if I saw it every day, I would question myself. I would rehearse conversations that hadn't happened. I would build scenarios in my mind that would make me angry or sad before the moment even came. And I didn't want that. I didn't want to stand in front of him one day with rage boiling out of me. I wanted calm. I wanted stillness. I wanted to be able to say, this is my answer, without trembling, without shaking, without lowering myself to the chaos he had created. I don't think people realize how heavy a small box can feel when it carries meaning instead of objects. Every time I opened that closet afterward, even for something unrelated, I could feel that weight. It was as if the box had its own presence, its own heartbeat, its own quiet message reminding me that when the truth finally came out, I wouldn't need time to think, react, or gather myself. I would already be ready. There were nights when I would sit on the edge of the bed after he'd fallen asleep and replay the past, not to torture myself, but to understand how long I had ignored the truth knocking at my door. I remembered the moments he would avoid looking me in the eyes, the times he was overly affectionate out of nowhere, not because he felt love, but because he felt guilt. The times he bought gifts that had no occasion, not romantic gifts, not meaningful gifts, just placeholders for honesty he didn't have the courage to bring. And every memory felt like another thread, leading toward the day the box would be needed. People often think that strength means confronting someone at the moment of betrayal, exploding, demanding answers, but sometimes strength is quieter. Sometimes it's sitting with the truth alone, making peace with it, and preparing for the day you'll speak it out loud. There's a kind of power in that silence, a power he never sensed, because he never imagined that I would stop waiting for him to decide when to tell the truth. I had already decided how I would respond long before he whispered anything. The days leading up to my birthday felt strange. He was restless, pacing sometimes, staring at his phone longer than necessary, sighing like he carried a world of unspoken things. He tried to act normal, but guilt makes even the simplest actions unnatural, and I watched him quietly, not with suspicion, but with acceptance. Because I knew a confession was coming. You can tell when a person can no longer hold their own secrets. They become clumsy with their lies. Their voice shakes. Their smile becomes mismatched with their eyes. Their touch feels like a question instead of comfort. And each passing moment made the box feel heavier in my memory, as if it was calling me to prepare myself. What he didn't know, what he could never have guessed, was that the box held more truth than his confession ever could. His confession would be about what he had done. The box was about what I had learned, the difference between his actions and my understanding, the difference between his choices and my consequences, the difference between what he broke and what I was finally ready to walk away from. One evening, a few days before my birthday, I actually took the box out of the closet and sat with it on my lap, not to open it, not to add anything, but just to feel the decision I had made. It was light, physically, but emotionally, it was heavier than anything I had ever carried. I ran my fingers across the edges, thinking of all the versions of me he had taken for granted, the forgiving version, the patient version, the compromising version, and I realized that the box didn't just hold an answer for him. It held closure for me. The kind of closure you do not wait to receive from someone who hurt you, but the kind of closure you give yourself when you finally understand your own worth. There's something remarkably empowering about preparing something silently while the other person thinks they are still in control of the narrative. He had no idea that every time he rehearsed his confession in his mind, thinking he would guide the moment, shape the outcome, decide the next chapter, I had already written mine. And not out of bitterness, out of liberation, out of the understanding that the pain he delivered would not be the final word. The night before my birthday, he kissed me a little too long. He held my hand a little too tightly. He lingered beside me like someone terrified of losing something they never bothered to protect. And I almost felt sorry for him, not because of what he had done, but because he thought the confession would give him relief. He thought telling the truth after years of hiding it would cleanse him. But the truth doesn't purify a person when they reveal it for themselves. It only purifies when it is revealed for those they hurt, and he wasn't doing it for me. He was doing it for the weight he wanted to drop from his own chest. I slept peacefully that night, not because I felt calm, but because I felt certain. Certainty can be the softest pillow in the world, the kind of certainty that tells you you don't have to control the storm because you already built a shelter. And that shelter was sitting quietly in the back of my closet, waiting. And then the morning arrived, my birthday. People think dramatic moments come with warning music, heavy tension, theatrical timing. But real moments, the ones that change your life, often arrive quietly. The sun was soft. The kitchen smelled like tea. Everything looked normal. But inside, I felt the universe shifting, preparing me, telling me this would be the day the box fulfilled its purpose. He couldn't look me in the eyes all morning. His hands trembled when he poured his tea. He dropped his spoon. He laughed nervously at things that weren't funny, and I watched him gently, knowing the moment was coming, knowing that once he began speaking, nothing would ever go back to what it had been. And yet I felt strangely calm, because when you already know your own answer, Someone else's confession loses its power. When he finally told me everything, his voice breaking, his words stumbling, his eyes avoiding mine, I didn't cry. I didn't shout. I didn't ask a single question. Not because I wasn't hurting, but because his confession wasn't new to me. I had already lived it in silence. I had already mourned it alone. I had already accepted the truth long before he had the courage to say it, and that is why the box mattered. It wasn't my reaction to his confession. It was the proof that I had been living in truth even while he lived in lies. It was the proof that I had stepped into clarity long before he stepped into honesty. It was the proof that my response was not emotional, it was intentional. I stood up, walked into the bedroom, and opened the closet. My hand didn't shake as I picked up the box. It felt light again, like it had been waiting for this moment to exhale. I held it gently, almost tenderly, knowing this small object carried everything I couldn't say in words, and I carried it back to him, the same way someone carries a final chapter they are ready to close. He looked at it with confusion, with fear, with the awareness that he was no longer the one directing the moment. I placed it in front of him slowly, letting the silence speak for me. And as he stared at it, trying to understand, trying to prepare himself, trying to guess what it meant, I felt the calmest I had felt in years, because this box, this small, simple box, was the answer to the confession he thought would define our future. And I knew, as I watched him reach for it with trembling hands, that everything from this moment forward would finally belong to me. And that is why I had prepared it long before he ever spoke a word. I already knew my ending. I was just waiting for him to finish his beginning. When he finally reached for that box, the room felt like it had inhaled with him. Everything became still, not peaceful, but suspended. Like the quiet before thunder. I could see his fingers shake as he touched the lid, as if the cardboard itself held something heavier than truth, heavier than guilt, heavier than any consequence he had imagined. And yet, for me, that moment felt strangely light. It was as if every breath I had been holding for years finally loosened in my chest. I wasn't angry. I wasn't trembling. I wasn't desperate for him to understand. I was simply present, grounded, prepared, because the box wasn't a reaction to his confession. It was the completion of a journey I had already taken. He looked up at me once, just for a second, searching my face for any sign of forgiveness or rage or softness, anything he could cling to, anything he could negotiate with. But my expression didn't give him anything. I wasn't cold. I wasn't unreachable. I was simply done. And there is a kind of calmness that appears only when a person reaches the end of a road they once walked with their whole heart. It is not pride. It is not detachment. It is the stillness that comes when you finally realize you no longer need anything from the person standing in front of you. I watched him take a deep breath, long, shaky, the kind of breath someone takes when they know they're about to lose something they took for granted. He slid his thumb under the edge of the lid, and in that moment, I felt every memory between us pass through me like a silent reel. The early years when he was gentle, the days when his laughter filled the rooms we shared, the evenings we held hands without thinking about it, the promises we made, the vows he broke, the slow erosion of trust, the moments of uncertainty that I had tucked away because I wanted to believe in us more than I wanted to believe in my own intuition. All of it flickered through me and then dissolved, like a chapter finally flattening itself into a single page. He opened the box, and the silence that followed was nothing short of profound. His eyes scanned the inside. His face changed, not dramatically, not with shock or anger, but with a sinking recognition. He understood what it meant. He understood exactly what I was saying without speaking a word. Because sometimes the simplest objects speak the loudest truths. He reached inside and pulled out the envelope. His name was written on it in handwriting he recognized too well. Not rushed, not emotional, just steady, deliberate, final. The moment he saw his name in that calm, controlled script, something inside him seemed to collapse. He swallowed hard. He blinked rapidly. His breathing quickened. I could see the reality of everything he had confessed beginning to settle into him, not just the guilt, but the consequence. He opened the envelope slowly, as if hoping the meaning of its contents might change if he stalled long enough. But paper doesn't lie. It doesn't soften or twist itself to protect someone from the weight of their actions. Paper tells the truth with brutal simplicity, and inside that envelope was a truth he had never expected. Not fury, not revenge, but clarity. He held the papers with trembling hands, reading every word as if each sentence was another step toward a cliff he had been walking toward for years without realizing it. And I watched him, not out of satisfaction, not out of cruelty, but out of the quiet understanding that this moment was necessary. It was necessary for him to see what he had really broken, necessary for him to feel the weight of something he could not manipulate, necessary for him to know that the consequences he feared were not punishments, but choices I made for my own peace. As he read, his lips parted slightly, as if he wanted to speak but could find the courage to interrupt the truth staring back at him. His shoulders fell, his breath became unsteady. His eyes, already wet with guilt, began to tremble with a realization he had never prepared for, because a confession gives relief, but consequences give accountability. He looked up at me again, this time not searching for forgiveness, but searching for a way to stop the ground from shifting beneath him. And for the first time in our entire relationship, he saw me clearly, not as the woman he assumed would always be there, not as the shield he used to hide behind, not as the heart he counted on to bend and bend until eventually healed around his mistakes. He saw me as a person who had finally chosen herself. He tried to speak. The first attempt came out only as a whisper, too weak to form a sentence. The second attempt sounded like a plea, but no words followed. Finally, he managed to say my name softly, desperately, as if saying it might anchor him to a version of us that no longer existed. I didn't respond, not because I wanted to hurt him, but because that moment wasn't about words. It wasn't about explanations or debates or arguments. It was about truth. The truth he had avoided for years, the truth I had accepted long before that day. The truth neither of us could run from anymore. He looked back down at the papers in his hands, as if hoping the sentences would rewrite themselves. But they didn't. They stayed still, unchanging, undeniable, and I could see in the way his shoulders shook that he understood the full meaning of everything inside that box. He understood that the answer I had given him was not an emotional reaction to his confession, but a decision I had made when I realized I did not need to wait for his guilt to guide my future. He placed the papers back inside the box with trembling fingers. He stared at the envelope for a long moment, as if trying to gather the courage to ask me if this was really happening. But he didn't ask. He couldn't. Because somewhere deep inside, he already knew the answer. We sat there in that heavy, quiet room, him drowning in the weight of what he'd finally done, and me feeling lighter than I had felt in years. It wasn't joy. It wasn't triumph. It was release, the kind of release that comes when you finally put down a burden that was never yours to carry. The kind of release that allows you to breathe without remembering the shape of your pain. The kind of release that whispers you survived. You healed. You chose yourself. He whispered my name again, softer this time, as if speaking too loudly. Might shatter the last fragile pieces of what he had hoped to hold on to. His voice cracked. And then, in a voice barely audible, he said, "Is this really what you want?" I looked at him with a calmness that surprised even me. Not cold, not indifferent, just honest. And I realized in that moment that the answer had been forming inside me long before the question was asked, long before he confessed, long before he opened that box. I took a slow breath, steady and certain. I didn't need rehearsed words. I didn't need anger to guide my tone. I didn't need to justify anything, because the truth, the real truth, doesn't require explanation. I gently closed the lid of the box, and in a voice as steady as the decision that brought me to that moment, I gave him the only answer that needed to be spoken. I already made my choice. When the words left my mouth steady, calm, unmistakably final, I could feel the entire atmosphere in the room shift. There was no echo, no dramatic gasp, no thunder rolling in the background, just a quiet truth settling into both of us like dust after a long storm. For a moment, neither of us moved. He stared at me with eyes that suddenly seemed much older, much heavier, as if everything he had hidden for years had finally aged him in the span of a few seconds. And I stood there feeling something I hadn't felt in a very long time, the weight of someone else's choices no longer resting on my shoulders. He lowered his gaze slowly, almost as if he couldn't bear to look at me, not because he didn't care, but because he knew deep down that the version of me who had once waited for him, once trusted him, once loved him without hesitation, was no longer standing in front of him. And there's a certain kind of heartbreak that doesn't make a person fall apart, it makes them see clearly. He was seeing clearly for the first time. I had been seeing clearly for months. I didn't feel anger. I didn't feel cold. I didn't feel vindicated. What I felt was something far quieter and far stronger, liberation. A soft, steady kind of liberation that doesn't scream, doesn't boast, doesn't strike back. It simply unfolds inside you like a truth you've always known but never spoken aloud. And once it unfolds, You realize you can never fold yourself back into the person you were before. I stepped away from him that day with a kind of grace I didn't even know I possessed. Not because I felt superior, but because I finally understood that leaving a situation is not about winning or losing. It's about recognizing where your spirit cannot grow. And mine could not grow in a place built on half-truths, on apologies stitched together with temporary promises, on love that had slowly turned into duty, then habit, then silence. Walking away is often portrayed as a dramatic act, something loud, something final, something heavy. But the real walk away, the kind that changes a life, is often quiet. It lives in the lift of your chin, the steadiness in your breath, the softness of your steps. It lives in the way you look at yourself in the mirror and realize, I am finally choosing me. And in that moment, choosing yourself doesn't feel selfish. It feels like recovering something you shouldn't have lost in the first place. In the days that followed, I noticed something strange. The world didn't collapse. The sun still rose. My heartbeat stayed steady. And the air somehow felt light.